Welcome, welcome to my Samhain, to my Halloween abode. The days are growing shorter and colder, the nights longer and darker, and the harvest has been brought home. The wheat and the barley from the fields has been cut. The fruit on the boughs of the trees, the ripe and rosy apples, the juicy pears and succulent plums have been plucked. And now we've reached Samhain, that time of year when the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead is at its thinnest. We usually call it Halloween, and it's a time when we think of the dead departed. I'm Noel the Storyteller, and I'm going to share 3 dark tales with you of the dangers that can await us if we encounter witches, ghosts, or even death, him or herself. But before I regale you with a tale, riddle me this. What is higher than the highest, lower than the lowest, greater than God but worse than the devil? Dead men eat it, but if you eat it, you die. I'll tell you it one more time. What's higher than the highest, lower than the lowest, greater than God, but worse than the devil? Dead men eat it, but if you eat it, you die. You might want to pause the recording for a moment and have a chat to the other people who are listening with you. Can you think of anything it could be? Can you think of something it might be? Have you figured it out? What is it that dead men eat? They don't eat anything, they eat nothing at all, so the answer to the riddle is nothing. Within our country, the tradition of telling stories is long and well established, especially in Wales and Scotland. And my first 2 stories are from Scotland, and they feature things which are strongly associated with our neighbours to the north. So, listen well as I tell my very first tale. There once was a fisherman who had a little cottage, a croft, on which he would grow potatoes and vegetables. And he also went out in his fishing boat with his 2 sons, and they would catch fish to sell in the neighbouring towns. One morning they set out, and it was a cloudy morning, and the skies, they grew darker and darker, and eventually it began to rain heavily, and then the wind began to pick up, and soon the fishermen realised they were in the eye of the storm, and their fishing boat was being tossed this way and that, and he realised that he needed to take the fishing boat back to the harbour. And so they struggled to get the boat back along the coast, and they were approaching the harbour when a gust of wind pushed the boat onto the rocks, and the keel of the boat, it was split asunder as it hit the ragged rocks there on the shoreline. Now some of the villagers nearby, they saw what had happened, and they came and they helped the fisherman and his 2 sons to scramble off of the boat. But it was clear to the fisherman that his boat was badly damaged. And so after he and his sons had made their way home, and they'd dried themselves off, and they'd had some porridge to eat, he set out straight away into the neighbouring woods to find a fine tree that he might fell, which would give him the wood to fix the keel of the boat. Well, all that afternoon he looked throughout the woods to find the perfect tree to fell. But some, they were just too narrow. Some were knotted, and even though he looked high and low, he couldn't find the perfect tree. And by now the day was growing long. It was beginning to get dark, And when he looked up, he realised he had no idea where he was. He was totally lost. And then he thought, well, how am I going to find my way home? I could easily get lost in the dark. And it was then in the distance he saw a twinkling light, and he thought, I'd best go there and see if they might let me stay for the night, and perhaps they might be kind enough to give me something to eat. And so he walked towards the light and eventually came to a little tumble-down cottage, and he knocked on the door. The door creaked open, and there stood an ancient old woman. One eye was peering up to the ceiling, another down to the floor. And she said, "Aye, aye." And he explained how he was lost and why he was out in the wood. And he said, please, could I come in? Could I come in and warm myself? Perhaps you could offer me something to eat, and I'd be ever so grateful if I could stay here for the night. Well, she beckoned him in, and he realised it wasn't just one old woman that lived there, but three. One was busy stirring a pot, another was reading a book, and so they welcomed him in, and soon he was eating a bowl of stew. But the old women were huddled together. They seemed to be talking about him, because from time to time they'd look up at him. But this didn't bother him. He was just happy to have somewhere warm and dry and to have some food in his belly. Eventually he was growing more and more tired, and he was beginning to nod off next to the fire, when one of the old women said, Come, we'll show you to a room where you can sleep for the night." And so he followed the old woman down the corridor and into the bedroom. And he undressed and he got into bed, and it was cool beneath the sheets. Now it was quite a bare room. There was just a simple chest there. Well, strangely, he didn't fall asleep immediately. And a few minutes after laying down, he heard the door creak. And then he realised that one of the old women was coming into his room, and she walked down the side of the bed. He could see her there in the candlelight. And then she went over to the chest, and she lifted up the lid of the chest, and she reached in, and there in the half-light he could see her putting on a bonnet, tying it beneath her whiskery chin, and shouting, "Mixty Moxty, London again!" And as he peered at her, she disappeared. He thought this was very odd. A few minutes later, the second old woman came in, and it was the same again. She walked down the side of the bed, she went to the chest, she lifted up the lid of the chest, she put on her bonnet, and "Mixty Moxty, London again!" And no sooner had she gone than the third old woman came in, and she seemed to be in quite a hurry. Once again she went to the chest, she reached in, she took the bonnet and did it up underneath her chin. "Mixty Moxty, London again!" And she too vanished. Well, the fisherman thought this was all very odd. He felt quite uneasy about it. And so he got up out of bed and he dressed, and he thought, I might get lost in the dark, but I don't know if I want to stay here, because there's something uncanny about this. There's something rather odd about this. But it was then that curiosity got the better of him, because he was curious about what else might be in that old wooden chest. And so he went over to the wooden chest and he lifted up the lid. And when he looked in, all he could find was one final bonnet. And I don't know why, but he lifted out the bonnet and he put it on his head. And he was curious. He was curious about where they'd gone. And he wondered if he could find out by saying the same as they had. So he did it up underneath his chin, and he said, "Mixty Moxty, London again." And all of a sudden he found himself travelling through the air, and he could see the sea beneath him, and then he could see hills and lights, and he could feel the wind on his face, and then he saw himself travelling above a great city with many, many lights and a great river and bridges, and all of a sudden he landed with a bump, and he found himself in a cellar, in the cellar of what looked to be a pub. Well, he looked around, he could see bottles of wine, he could see great big barrels of beer, and in one corner he could see the three old women, and they were laid flat out on the floor, snoring. And near to them, there were barrels of whiskey, and the whiskey was still spilling out onto the floor. And he thought to himself, it's a terrible waste. It's a terrible waste. So he went to each and every barrel of whiskey, and he turned the spigots, he turned the taps so that the whiskey wouldn't flow out anymore. But then he thought, it'd be nice to try this whiskey. I'm sure it's good. And so he went to the first barrel and he had a little sip, and it tasted really, really fiery in his throat, and peaty and earthy. And he thought, that's nice. And then he went to the second one, and once again he had a wee dram of that, and this time it was peachy and smooth. Well, after those two he tried several more, and then he began to feel quite woozy. He woke up with a start. Somebody was kicking him. Somebody was kicking him. I've got you. I've got you. You've ruined my business. You've been here time and time again. And it's not just the fact you're drinking my whiskey. It's all the whiskey you waste by not turning off the taps. I've got you, you rascal. You're going to pay for this. He looked up and he saw a man, an angry looking man. And he realised that it was probably the publican, the landlord. And the landlord, he got him up by the scruff of the neck and he said, you're coming with me. You're going to pay for what you've done. And he was taken upstairs, and then the police were called. And then he was taken away to the police station and thrown into the cells. Well, it wasn't long before he was brought before the judge. And of course, he explained it all. He explained how he was a fisherman from Scotland and how his boat had been ground on the rocks and how the keel had been damaged and how he'd gone into the woods to find some wood that could fix the keel of the boat, and then how he'd come to the old woman's cottage and how he'd seen them putting on the bonnets, and so he was curious. And that's how he'd ended up there in the cellar. But they just said there weren't any old women there. And it was true. When he'd woken up, there was no sign of those three women. And so did they believe a word that he said? No, not one word of it. And so it was decided that he would hang for his crimes. The next morning he walked up the wooden steps and on to where the gibbet was set up. And a noose was put around his neck. And it was then he just reached into his pocket and he felt something soft. And he realised it was the bonnet. And he looked at the executioner, the hangman, and he said, could I have one last request? I'm an innocent man, you know, I'm an innocent man. And the hangman said, there's nothing innocent about you. What's the request? Could I just put this wee bonnet on my head? You can put whatever you like on your head, said the hangman. And so he put the bonnet on his head, and as soon as it was on his head, he said, Mixty moxty, Kintail again. And then he found himself travelling through the air. The wind was whisking around his face. And there with him was the gibbet with the noose round his neck. And for a while, the hangman was there too, until he fell down into the sea and was lost forever. And on he travelled until eventually he landed with a thump down in the woods where he'd searched for a tree to fell. And when he looked at that gibbet, that scaffold, he realised it was just the right sort of wood he'd need for the keel of his boat. And so, A few days later, he found a carpenter, and they used that wood to fix his boat. And as far as I know, his ancestors are still fishing the waters around Kintyre. Now that was a close escape, wasn't it? Now, for my second story, we're going to also go north of the border. And in this story, we have another thing that's very typical of Scotland. Because in our second story, our hero is a piper, and he would have played bagpipes such as these. But before I tell you this story, I've got another riddle for you. And it's a riddle that relates to one of the things in the tale. So riddle me this. I have 4 stiff standers, 4 dilly-danders, 2 lookers, 2 crookers, and a wigwag. What has 4 stiff standers, 4 dilly-danders, 2 lookers, 2 crookers, and a wig-wag? Have a chat to whoever you are listening with. Can you guess what it is? It's a kind of animal. Shall I show you? It's a cow. Because the 4 stiff standers are the legs. The 4 dilly-danders are the teats on the udder. The lookers are the eyes, and the crookers are the horns. Once there was a man who made his living by entertaining folk, just like modern day buskers do, that you might see when you're in a subway or you're in the city and somebody's strumming a guitar, perhaps with backing music, or somebody's playing a fiddle. Well, long ago up in Scotland, bagpipe players would travel from place to place, and they'd earn a bit of a living, and they'd get somewhere to stay and something to eat by playing people a tune or two. It was a cold, cold winter. So cold, in fact, that there was ice upon the ground, and it had started to snow, and times were hard for the piper. He'd just been in one little town for some time, and it was time to move on. And as he walked along, he realised he had to do something about his boots, because one of his boots had a bit of a hole in it, and the sole of the boot was coming away. So when he trudged through the snow was getting into his boot, and his feet, they were frozen, absolutely frozen. But he shuffled along, and he pulled his coat around him, and he wondered when it would be he'd reach the next village or town. Anywhere would do, to tell you the truth, because he was desperate for somewhere now to lay his head. As he walked through the snow, which was getting thicker and thicker as he walked, all of a sudden he stumbled over something there on the path, and he could see a hump which was covered in snow, and he was curious about what it was. So he got down on his hands and his knees, and he used his hands, and he began to clear away the snow. And it was then that he unearthed a face. The face of an old man with a beard and eyebrows covered in icicles, and he cleared away the rest of the body, and he was quite well dressed, and eventually cleared all the way right down to the feet. And when he cleared the snow from the feet, he realised that he had a really, really good pair of boots on. Well, the piper wasn't a man to want to waste things. You know, he had to make his living by playing music, and it wasn't an easy way to earn a crust. And when he saw this really fine pair of boots on the dead man, he thought, well, he's got no need of them. Now, he always always carried some tools with him. And so he took the bag of tools off his shoulder and he put them on the ground. And then he had a thought. He had a thought to see if the dead fella there in the snow might give him his boots. And so he went down to the foot end and he tried to undo the laces, and he managed to do it a bit, but no matter how hard he tugged and heaved, he couldn't get either of the boots off. Then he thought to himself, well, there's another way to do this. And so he went into his bag of tools and he got out a saw, and he lifted up the saw, and there at the ankle joint he began to saw. Eventually it sawed all the way through the leg, where the leg met the ankle, and the ankle fell away, and with it that beautiful new boot. He went to the other foot and soon he'd sawn through that too. And then he took the laces of the boots and he tied them together so that the boots were now resting on his chest. And he looked down at the old fellow in the snow and he said, I thank you. I thank you very much. I thank you for your boots. God rest you. And then he walked on. And now he had a bit more hope, because he realised the next time he walked he'd have a good pair of boots and that would keep his feet warm. But it was still a long way to go, and eventually he thought, where on earth am I going to rest? But then he saw a light. He saw a light, and ahead of him he could see there was a farmhouse. And so he went to the farmhouse door and he knocked. Now inside he could see there was a farmer and his wife, and they were sitting there and they seemed to be enjoying a roast dinner, and he could smell roast chicken and gravy, and it looked as if they were also having a wee dram of whiskey, and he thought, oh, they just let me in and share a bit of that food. And so eventually the door opened and the farmer looked out at the piper. He said, what do you want? He said, oh, I don't suppose I could stop here for the night. No, clear off. Don't like the look of you. Don't want your services. Clear off. Be gone. And he slammed the door. He slammed the door in his face. The poor piper thought, I can't sleep out in the snow. I'll freeze to death. He knocked again. It took some time before the farmer came back to the door. He said, I thought I told you to clear off. But then the woman spoke up. Husband, why don't you let him sleep in the barn? He could sleep in the barn with the cow. All right. Look, just follow the track here and you'll come to our barn. You can sleep there for the night. Now leave us in peace. And so the piper, he trudged down the track towards the barn. But it wasn't much of a barn, because there was a hole in the roof where the snow was coming through. And in that barn, well, there were a few bales of hay and some of it was strewn out on the ground. And there was a cow chewing the cud. And it was still cold. I mean, with the snow coming through the roof, he could still feel the cold air. But he thought to himself, if he laid down next to the uddery belly of the cow, then he might just about manage to survive through the night. And so he lay down next to the cow, and it was then that he had a thought. He had a thought to pop those boots with the dead man's feet into them underneath the belly of the cow. And then he snuggled up to the cow and he fell fast asleep. When he woke up in the morning, he had a bit of an idea. Well, he went over to the boots and he found that he now could pick out the feet because they'd thawed enough. And so he took the feet out of those beautiful boots and he took off his old tackety boots and he put the dead man's feet into them, and then he pushed the old boots with the dead men's feet underneath the cow, because he thought he wanted to pay back that mean-spirited farmer. And then he hid behind one of the bales of straw. And he waited, because he reckoned that the farmer's wife wasn't so hard-hearted as her husband. And he was right, because a little bit later, the farmer's wife came down the lane and she peered in. She was looking to see whether or not the piper was awake, and to see if she might offer him a cup of tea. But when she peered in, what did she see? The cow chewing. And beneath the cow, a pair of boots with feet in them. And she looked at the cow, and she looked at the boots, and she looked at the cow, and she looked at the boots, and she said, "Ah! Ah! The cow's eaten the piper! The cow's eaten the piper! Husband! Husband! The cow's eaten the piper!" And she went running all the way back up to the farm, and she burst in through the door, and she said, "Husband! Husband! The cow's eaten the piper! Husband! Husband! Come quickly!" Well, he looked at his wife as if she'd gone mad, and he said, "What on earth are you talking about, woman?" But she led him back to the barn, and there, sure enough, he could see the pair of boots and the feet in them. And he said, "We could be in trouble. We could be in trouble. We'd best do something. I know, we'd best get rid of the evidence." And so he picked up those boots with the feet in them, and he carried them out into his vegetable plot. And then he dug down. I think he dug 2 feet deep. And he put the boots with the feet into the earth, and he covered it up. And then the two of them went back into the farmhouse. And it was then that the piper thought he would continue to have his fun with them. And so he came out of his hiding place, and he strode out into the vegetable plot, and he picked up his pipes, and he began to play. And they looked out, and the husband said, "It's the piper! It's the piper! He's come back! He's come back to haunt us! Oh, husband, husband! Not only might we be in terrible trouble, but we're going to be haunted! Husband, husband, we can't stay here!" And so the two of them, they bolted out of the door and down the lane. And the piper, he smiled to himself, and he walked into the house, and there he helped himself to a dram or 2 of the whiskey, and he looked to see what was left of the cold chicken, and he began to eat that hungrily. And he was just relaxing in front of the fire when he heard a knocking. And he was certain it couldn't be the farmer and his wife. And so he went to the door, and he opened the door, and there on the doorstep he saw an old man, and there was snow in his eyebrows and snow on his beard, and he was deathly white. And the piper said, "Oh, you look frozen. You look frozen. Come in, come in, come in and warm your feet." And the man on the doorstep said, "I would if I had any." The piper looked down at where his feet should be, and he could see that he was floating above the surface of the ground, and blood was drip, drip, dripping into the snow. Before I tell you my final story, one more riddle. So riddle me this. The man who made me didn't want me. The man who bought me didn't use me. The man who used me didn't see me. The man who made me didn't want me. The man who bought me didn't use me. The man who used me didn't see me. And to give you a bit of a clue, this is a grave riddle. Very grave. Do you have any idea what it is? why wouldn't the person who used it see it? Do you want to pause the recording and have a think? I'll give the answer. The answer is a coffin. Now, my final story comes from a country I visited when I was much younger. It's the country of Mexico. And whilst I was in Mexico, I visited a town called Oaxaca. And in Oaxaca, I saw a procession. And it was similar to lots of processions you might see. There was music, there were floats, sweets were being thrown to the children. But there was one thing about it which was rather strange, rather uncanny. And that was, amongst all this festivity and joy, there was a dark figure, a dark foreboding figure of an old woman clad in black. And I was curious about who this was and why she was part of the celebration. And so I asked one of the local people, and they said, that is La Muerta. That is Godmother Death. And for us, she's important. Because sometimes life is so hard that you can even welcome death. And here's my final story. Once was a farmer, a very poor tenant farmer by the name of Antonio. Now, Antonio had to work on other people's lands. He would help to clear the weeds, he would help to sow the seed, he would help to bring in the harvest, and he would earn a little bit of money. Now, Antonio lived in a tiny little shack with his wife, and at one point they had had 6 children. But when Antonio heard a 7th would be born, you would have thought his heart would sink because they had little enough as it was. But something extraordinary happened, because his 7th child was born on the Mexican Day of the Dead. And if you're born on that day, it's said to bring good fortune. And as soon as the boy was born, they could see he looked strong. And Antonio said to his wife, I'm going to find the perfect godmother for my son. She must be merciful, she must be powerful, she must be just. For this is the Mexican Day of the Dead, and we have a new son, and only the best godmother will do. And so he embraced his wife, he held his child in his arms for a few moments, and he said, we will call him Julio. And then he set out along the road looking for a godmother, a madrina. As he walked along, all of a sudden, a coach pulled by 4 fine horses came past, and it slowed, and it stopped, and then a woman looked out and said, it's Antonio, isn't it? Why are you out? This is a day when most people are at home celebrating, because it's the Day of the Dead. And he explained how he was looking for a madrina, he was looking for a godmother. And the rich woman in the carriage said, I could be godmother for your newborn. It's always good to offer your services on this most auspicious of days. If I was godmother to your son, he would want for nothing. He'd have the finest things to play with, the most beautifully made clothes. And I could help you out. But he looked at the rich woman and he said, no, you have seen how I have suffered, you have seen the poverty we've lived in, and yet you've never offered to help before. You might be powerful because you're wealthy, but you're not just, and you're not merciful. I thank you, but no. And then he walked on. And he left the rich woman frowning. Well, he walked on for quite some time, until he went past a field, and it was then that he saw a woman he recognised coming towards him. She was a kindly woman who was there at the birth of babies and when folks were dying, and she approached Antonio and said, Antonio, why aren't you at home on this most auspicious of days? And he said, I'm looking for a godmother. My wife has given birth to a new baby boy, Julio. I'm looking for a special woman to be godmother. And she said, Antonio, I could be godmother to your son. And he looked at her and he said, oh, you might make a good godmother because you are merciful. You are always there when people are struggling, and you show such care and kindness. And you are just because you treat everyone in the same way. But like me, you have little power because you're poor, so I thank you with all my heart, but no, I must continue my search. And he carried on walking along the road. But by now it was growing darker and darker, and he was there out in the semi-desert amongst the cacti. All of a sudden he saw a dark figure approaching him, clad in black. And then she stopped and she said, I know why you are here. I know why you are here, Antonio. You are looking for a godmother, are you not? And he said, how do you know? Who are you? Don't you recognize me, Antonio? 3 times I've come to your house when your children have been sick or hungry, and rather than let them suffer, I've taken their souls away. He said, is it you? Is it you, Godmother Death? Is it you, La Muerta? She said, yes, I could be godmother. And he thought, you are truly powerful, for no one can resist you, Godmother Death, and you are just because you treat rich and poor in the same way, and you are merciful too, for you bring suffering to an end. And then he said, yes, you can be godmother to my son. And he turned away and he went back and he told his wife the news. And, well, it was unusual to have such a godmother, but she accepted it. And from that day on, their lives seemed to turn for the better. Their son, he grew up healthy and fit and strong, and he helped his father out in the land. And on his 16th birthday, there was a knocking on the door. And there, as he opened the door, he saw La Muerta, and she said, come with me, Julio. It's time for me to teach you some new skills. And she taught him how to heal the sick. She taught him about all manner of potions, all manner of ointments and pills, so that he could be a physician, a doctor. And after he'd stayed with her and searched through the desert and in the woodland for all manner of ingredients, she said, now, Julio, there is one final thing I will show you. She took him out into the desert, and under the moon she found a tiny blue flower, and she said, this blue flower, when it is made into a tincture, can bring the dead back to life. But you must only use it if you see me at the head of the bed. For if you see me at the foot of the bed, I have come for that person's soul, and you may not give the herb, do you understand? And he said, yes, Godmother, yes, I understand. Well, he had listened well, and he'd learned many things, and soon he was able to heal many sick people in the nearby village and the nearby towns. And always when he came to someone who was dying, he saw where La Muerta stood, and if she was there at the foot of the bed, he knew that he must not give them the herb of life. One day, there was a great knocking on the door, and when he went to the door, he saw two finely dressed men, and they said, we have come from the king. The king is deathly ill, and we have heard that you are able to cure every one of their ailments. Come, come. And soon he was sat on the back of the horse, and they were riding like the wind. On and on they rode through the desert until finally they came to the palace of the king, and they opened the gates. And then he was shown up the steps and along the corridor, and upstairs he went until there he was in the king's bed. And he could see the king was deathly pale, and as he looked to see whether or not he could give him the herb of life, he saw Lamuerta there at the king's feet. And he thought, oh, if only I could heal the king, then I'd want for nothing. My family would never know poverty and hardship again. What can I do? What can I do? And then he had an idea, and he called to the servants and he said, turn the king's bed, turn the king's bed so his head is nearer to the window so he can get fresh air. And they turned the bed, and as they turned the bed, Lamuerta was no longer at the foot. And then he administered the herb of life. He put it in the king's mouth. And then colour began to return to the king's cheeks. Breath began to return to the king's chest. And a few minutes later, he sat up and he was well again. And Lamuerta, she looked at Julio and she shook her finger and she said, do not do that again. After the king's cure, Julio was invited to be the court physician. And as he dined with the king, he saw the king's daughter, and she was truly beautiful. And the two of them, they got talking to one another, and they realized how happy they felt in one another's company. And it was then that Julio went to the king and said, I would love to marry your daughter. Please let me have her hand in marriage. And well, the king, he owed Julio everything. He owed him his very life, and so it was agreed that the two of them could be married. But the strangest thing happened. Before the wedding was to be celebrated, his prospective wife became deathly ill. And there she was, laying in her bed. Her face was pallid, there was hardly any breath. And he thought, no, please, Godmother, don't take away this woman I already love with all my heart. But when he went to attend her, he could see Lamuerta at the foot of the bed, and he thought, no, please. But then he thought, I tricked her once, I could trick her again. And so once again he called for the servants to turn the bed, and as Lamuerta was at the head of the bed, he administered the herb again. And he didn't know this time if he might be struck down dead or if it wouldn't work, but colour returned to her cheeks and breath to her breasts, and she sat up and she smiled and she said, I'm well again, my love. And the next day the two of them were married, and there was a feast, and there was singing and dancing and storytelling, and eventually the two of them, they retired for the night. But early in the morning, there was a knock on the door, and Julio, he got up and he went to the door, and there stood Lamuerta, and she beckoned him, and he was powerless to resist. And she led him down the corridor and down the stairs and out into the night, and the stars and the moon were shimmering above. And she led him on and on through the desert, on and on until they came to a great rock face. And she took a staff and she struck the rock, and the rock broke open. And then he entered into that chasm, and he went down, down, down into the darkness. And it was cold. that suddenly, he could see hundreds of thousands of lights all twinkling away. And he said, Godmother, Godmother, where have you brought me? Godmother, where have you brought me? And she said, I've brought you to the candle of all souls. And you could see many different candles there. Some were short and stubby, some were tall and strong. And she took him into the very centre, and there was a tall light and a tiny, tiny candle. And he said, whose is that candle representing? Whose life does that represent? Because she said each and every candle in this cavern represents the life of some soul on earth. And she said, that is a light that represents the life of your son. Am I to be a father? Am I to be a father? Such a blessing, such a blessing. But then he looked at a tiny, stubby little candle, and he said, and whose is that? And she said, that, Julio, is yours. And he said, but it's so small, it's sputtering, it's nearly out. And she said, yes, Julio, because you tricked me once, you tricked me twice. And I am powerful, and I have been merciful, but now I will be just. And with that, she blew out the candle that represented the life of Julio. Farewell to those I know so well, do not go searching for me. Farewell to friends and companions, I'm on my final journey. And with that, the life of Julio of the remedies, faded away. I've been Noel the Storyteller, and I hope you've enjoyed these 3 stories for Samhain, these 3 stories for Halloween. And if you've enjoyed them, perhaps you might like to add some comments here on my YouTube page. And as a final gift, and as a thank you for listening, if you've managed to listen all this time, one last riddle, and perhaps you want to put the answers to that too. And here it is. The King of Northumberland gave the Queen of Cumberland a bottomless vessel to put flesh, blood and bone in. The King of Northumberland gave the Queen of Cumberland a bottomless vessel to put flesh, blood and bone in. What did he give her? And if you want a clue, it is perhaps something that Julio might have given to his princess, to his wife. And with that, I wish you a happy Samhain, a happy Halloween, however you celebrate it. And maybe you'll be carving pumpkins, maybe you'll be getting dressed up and having a party. But from me, for now, I offer you my blessings and my thanks. Good night.